I swear to you, this is one of the strangest true stories I've ever heard. Without further ado, let's begin with the first story. Around 1960, a night clerk was working at a small motel off a lonely highway somewhere in the United States. He said that at about 2 in the morning, a man walked into the lobby wearing a long black coat and a hat that hid most of his face. The man wanted a room for just one night. Right away, something felt off. He wasn't carrying any luggage, and he never once looked the clerk in the eyes. He simply laid some cash on the counter and said in a low, calm voice, "If you hear anything coming from my room, don't open the door." The clerk figured the guy was drunk or maybe dealing with some kind of mental problem, so he handed him a key. The man quietly walked upstairs to a room on the second floor. About an hour passed. Suddenly the clerk heard something heavy crash onto the floor upstairs. Then, silence. A few minutes later, he heard footsteps moving quickly around the room, almost like there was more than one person in there. Then another loud thud. The warning echoed in his head. Don't open the door. But by now he was getting nervous. He called the motel owner, who told him, "Go upstairs and make sure everything's okay." So he slowly climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark and strangely quiet. When he reached the room, he saw something that made him freeze. Light was spilling out from under the door, and there was the shadow of someone standing directly behind it. The shadow didn't move. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. The shadow suddenly disappeared. The clerk used the spare key and opened the door. The room was empty. The window was locked from the inside. There wasn't a closet big enough to hide in. There was nowhere anyone could have gone. And there wasn't a single sign of the man. But that wasn't the strangest part. Sitting on the table was a small piece of paper. It read, "I told you, don't open the door." The clerk swore nobody wrote it in front of him, and he insisted the room was completely empty when he walked in. According to his story, he quit his job a week later, and for the rest of his life, he kept saying, "To this day, I don't fear ghosts. I just fear finding out who was standing behind that door." The second story is stranger than the first. The woman who lived within the walls of a house. So there was this woman in a small town in Japan. Her name was Yuki, living alone in her quiet little apartment. And she started noticing things. Small things. The milk carton was a little lighter than she remembered. Some fruit would go missing. She'd wake up and her pillow was on the wrong side of the bed. At first she figured, whatever, work's been brutal, I'm just spacing out. But then things got weird. She'd lock the kitchen door before bed, like double check it, and wake up to find it wide open. Then one night she heard footsteps, soft ones, coming from above the ceiling. She flipped on every light in the apartment. Nothing. After a few weeks of this, she decided to set up a security camera. Next morning, she sat down with her coffee and hit play. For hours, nothing. Just an empty hallway. Then at 2 a.m., this small panel above the kitchen cabinet slowly pushed open. And a woman crawled out.
Oh my God, please tell me that
Thin,
I'm just imagining
wild
this.
hair, moving like she'd done this 100 times. She climbed down, opened the fridge, ate some food, drank some water, and then just stood there staring at Yuki's bedroom door for a few minutes before climbing back up. Yuki called the police with shaking hands. When the officers searched the apartment, they found a narrow crawl space between the ceiling and the walls. Inside, an old blanket, water bottles, a change of clothes. That woman had been living there for months, coming down every single night while Yuki was asleep. The man who lived with his mother's corpse. I first heard this story years ago, and honestly, it still gives me chills. In a quiet town in Japan, there was a man in his 40s who lived with his elderly mother. He rarely left the house and barely spoke to his neighbors. Every now and then, they'd see him buying groceries, then disappearing back inside for days. Then suddenly, weeks went by, and nobody saw his mother. One neighbor asked about her. The man smiled and said, "She's tired. She's been sleeping a lot." Another month passed, then another. Eventually, A strange smell started coming from the house. A neighbor called the police. When officers entered the home, they found the mother sitting in her usual chair in front of the television. But she wasn't asleep. She had been dead for months. The strangest part? The TV was still on, and on the table in front of her was a fresh plate of food and a cup of tea that was still warm. An officer asked, "Who put this food here?" The man looked at him confused. "I did. Every day. My mum doesn't like eating alone." For months, he'd been living beside his mother's body, talking to her and watching television with her every night, completely convinced she was still alive. The woman in the last train car. This story was told by a maintenance worker at an old train station. He said he always finished work after midnight. Almost every night, when the last train pulled into the station, he'd see a woman sitting in the very last car. She wore an old-fashioned dress and kept her hands folded in her lap. She never moved. At first, he thought she was waiting for someone. But something strange caught his attention. Every passenger would get off the train, except her. And every single time he stepped into the last car, it was empty. This went on for weeks. Then one night, he decided to watch her carefully. The train stopped. Nobody got off the last car. She was still sitting there. He opened the door and stepped inside. She was staring at the floor. He took one step closer. Slowly, she raised her head. He said her face was unnaturally pale and her eyes were red, like she hadn't slept in years. Then she whispered, "Where's my son?" The man panicked and ran out of the train. The next day, he told the station manager what had happened. The manager went silent. Then he said, 30 years ago there was a train accident here. A woman and her little boy died in the last car. The maintenance worker quit his job a week later and never worked another night shift again. The next story, after I finished reading it, made me afraid to look out the window at night. The knocking at the window. A man lived alone in a small house near a forest. One night at around 3 in the morning, he woke up to a sound. He opened his eyes. The sound was coming from his bedroom window. He froze. He lived on the second floor, and there were no trees, no balcony, nothing near that window. The knocking stopped. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. He slowly walked toward the window and pulled the curtain back just a little. Nobody. He went back to bed and tried to ignore it. A minute later, the knocking returned. This time it was louder. He checked the window again. Still nothing. So he called his friend, who was a police officer. His friend laughed and said, "Whatever you do, don't open that window. I'm on my way." The man waited. 10 long minutes passed. Then he heard a new sound. It wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was directly above him, on the roof. Something was moving slowly over his room, as if someone was crawling across the top of the house. Then his phone rang. It was his friend. His voice sounded tense. "I'm outside your house right now, and I don't want you looking out the window." The man swallowed hard. "Why?" The officer replied, "Because there's someone standing in your backyard, and they've been staring at your window for the last 10 minutes. But if someone was standing in the backyard, then who was crawling on the roof?" The call from upstairs. One cold winter night, a 17-year-old babysitter was watching 2 children in a large house. The kids had already fallen asleep, and she was sitting on the couch watching TV when the phone rang. She picked it up. A calm, low voice said, "Have you checked on the children?" She frowned, assuming it was some stupid prank, and hung up. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. "You should really go check on the children." Now she was getting uncomfortable, but she tried to ignore it. Then the phone rang a 3rd time. This time the voice said, "Why won't you go upstairs? They're waiting for you." Her hands started shaking. She immediately called the police. The officer told her to keep the caller talking if he called again. A few minutes later, the phone rang.
Please answer me.
As the man spoke,
you're there.
police traced the call. Suddenly, the officer came back on the line shouting, "Get out of the house right now! The call is coming from inside the house." She dropped the phone and ran toward the front door, crying. At that exact moment, she heard fast footsteps coming from upstairs. Police arrived minutes later and found a man hiding inside the children's bedroom. The babysitter never found out how long he'd been watching her from inside the house. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for following along and leave a comment so I can continue with these stories. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.